The Supreme Court is set to hear arguments in a case that could derail the future of affirmative action in higher education. Harvard and the University of North Carolina are set to defend how they use race, among other criteria, in their admissions process.
Conservative organization Students for Fair Admissions challenged the school's admitting procedures, contending that it violates their constitutional protections and federal law. They want the court to ban admissions offices from considering an applicant's race altogether. Here to discuss the ins and outs of this case and the arguments for what could be in store vis-a-vis affirmative action in higher ed is Ameshia Cross, a political strategist and attorney. Thank you for joining us again, Ameshia. Good to see you.
Always glad to be here.
So what are your feelings about this case?
Well, we knew that this was going to happen.
Yeah.
Affirmative action has come up in the courts now 4 times in the Supreme Court level, starting with 1979. And every time it has been upheld. The issue that I have
wasn't a 25-year expiration tag put on it in one of these cases? I remember Sandra Day O'Connor, I believe, saying that.
Yes. And quite frankly, right now, 7 states already don't use affirmative action, and that has been upheld by state law. With that being said, I think that when we look at what's happening with higher ed institutions, especially the more selective ones, are getting less diverse as the years go by. That's a problem because it's taking us back to a foregone era when you had individuals who had the acumen, who had the intelligence, who had the intellectual capacity, who literally were not getting admitted solely based on their race. Affirmative action in and of itself has not been what a lot of conservatives talk about in the sense of, oh, you're here because you're black or because you're brown. That it does not delineate itself from the entire package of a college admissions, of the college admissions packet. What is a problem here is that as we continue to look at the dismantling of diversity and equity and inclusion, this is something that goes down that path. And it's something that conservatives have been trying to push against for a while. It is also one that communications experts have not been able to talk about in a way that I think is helpful as we see our nation become more brown every day.
But when you see the filings in this case, you see how the admissions offices at Harvard and other places, the way that, it's the Asian students, part of this lawsuit is over Asian students, the way they talk about Asian students in terms of, well, they have less personality, we're gonna have too many of them, we don't want that, we want representatives of sparse country. It's a very racialized lens when you look at how the admissions offices are operating that I think is just wildly offensive and in fact stereotypical and racist. And I'm, happy to see them. If they're not allowed to do that anymore, it would make me happy. I do take your point that these institutions are getting less diverse, I think in large part because of other policies I would also like to get rid of, including legacy admissions, including the ridiculous sports-based, this was the way in which all the celebrities smuggled their kids into these schools, right? It was saying, oh, my little darling is a water polo champion, and just photoshopping their face onto a water polo player. All of that should end as well. But at the same time, I do happen to think that considering race is already banned under federal law, and the Supreme Court should recognize that. What's your feeling about it, Batya?
I have sort of 2 main issues with it, and I'm not sure what I'm hoping for from the Supreme Court because I'm not sure what exactly it can address from these things. The first is what you just said, Robby. There is a blatant and obvious discrimination against Asian Americans, and I find that to be so awful, people who fought so hard to get to this country for a fair shot at the American dream and knowing that their kid is facing racial discrimination. We know that Asians have to score 50 and 100 points higher on these standardized tests to be considered. It's so gross. It feels really wrong. But I think, Ameshia, to your point, it's just not working. It's not working to elevate the brilliant, forgotten kids in Black and Hispanic communities and getting them that fair shot at what their God-given talents should be ensuring them. So it's not working, and I wonder why that is. And then I guess I do have a third question, which is I think it's very important that our elites are more diverse. Don't get me wrong, that is a huge priority for a society that is based on equality the way ours pretends to be and wants to be. But it also sort of begs the question about what about everybody else? And I think that too often our conversations focus on how to get the few who are very brilliant into the ranks of the other brilliant people. And it sort of begs the question for me, what about everybody else?
Yeah, this discussion is going on right now, and I'm just following on Twitter. So Elena Kagan asked, has pointed out, there's no there's been a gender-based neutrality because they don't award points for men or for women, and the result of that has been
more white women.
A lot more
white
women
have, specifically white women. We have to be real about this. White women have been the largest beneficiaries of affirmative action to date.
But I guess I don't care. I guess I would say if women vastly outnumber men in higher education using a neutral test, then so be it. Like, I would not actually use policy to address that. I would say that would be because that would be discriminatory. That we giving a leg up to men because they're not doing as well for themselves as women that's not something I would do.
So higher ed has a plethora of issues that we probably don't even have enough time to talk about. One of them is the innate elitism, be it that a lot of people are there on legacy, be it that a lot of people are there because their parents, quite frankly, could afford to send them. And affirmative action initially on its onset was to provide more of an open playing field, was to be in the vein of what we saw with ending segregation in schools, was to be able to allow for individuals who normally would not have that access to walk through those doors. And in our most elite institutions, not only your Yales and Harvards of the world, but also in some of your state schools that are very strong. University of Michigan, for instance, has the strongest medical school in the country when it comes to undergraduate programs to get you into that medical school. With that being said, again, they don't even have the diverse numbers. No state in the country has the numbers in their school equaling the percentage of minorities in that state, particularly for Black and brown students. And it is irrespective of whether that state is led by a Democrat or a conservative. We do have large factual issues related to college admissions, and I do think that this is something we need to look into. No, affirmative action is not perfect. It never was perfect, but eradicating it entirely will only make a problem we already have a lot worse.
Doesn't that argue for doing more to help and foster and nurture the educational environments of minority students who are not placing in because they're not because there's anything different about them, but because they're in socioeconomic environments that leave them underprepared. They're in school systems that are not working as well. We need to fix all of those problems rather than just say, well, it's okay if you're 50 points off. You know, we're correcting for some kind of historical issue. You're in anyway, and then like those kids are going to be less likely, not in all cases, but they're going to be less likely to succeed.
No, I agree with you. Our K-12 system has 500,000 problems, and largely because schools are still funded by the local tax base. And at the end of the day, if you're somebody who grows up in an impoverished or underprivileged community, you're basically shot in the foot from the start. And we just don't have that level of resources in those communities. It has never been for lack of acumen or lack of intelligence amongst certain groups of people. It has largely been because of the way our education system is set up for particular communities to fail from the preschool age on out. And that's what we continue to see.
I totally agree with you about that. And I think to me, looking where we are now, I mean, I think affirmative action, when it was instantiated, it's so clear that it came from a place of, good intentions. But when I look now, I think, Robby, the point you raise where they're sort of trying to shortcut the problem. And the problem is that children are not getting equal access to a quality education. I agree with you, Ameshia. I think a lot of them are set up to fail because of the communities they come from. But to shortchange that and say we're going to select kids who are just never going to be able to compete with the kids of the already rich, already privileged, overwhelmingly white communities, I do think that there is a level at which, by shortcutting the avenue to the equity that I think probably we all want, you're actually harming a lot of the intended beneficiaries. And you hear these horrible stories about kids who are sort of from minority communities who were not prepared, not because of a lack of innate genius, which of course is equally distributed, but because they just were not raised the way these kids at elite schools are from third grade to be thinking about organic chemistry, right? And they take out these loans, they go to these elite institutions like Harvard that want a more diverse crowd, and then they drop out with these like insane student loan, like just stories that break your heart.
Yeah, that's a problem
too. And of course, how does a kid then feel about themselves, after that? So I think that trying to shortcut the solution is potentially very harmful.
And I again would encourage anyone interested in this issue to look at the filings, what the admissions officers actually said about Asian students, and it is as clear an example, in my view, of elite racism. It's racist thinking. There's no other way around it in terms of that. Now, what policy you have and what should change is a different issue. But I was gobsmacked at how open they were about just stereotyping about a whole group of people. All right, great discussion. We'll have more Rising right after this.